If you're hearing this right now, pause everything else. Because this message doesn't reach people by accident. It arrives only when a certain threshold has already been crossed. Here's the truth most never realize. Not all attacks come from mistakes. Not all suffering is a consequence. And not all opposition is earned. Some resistance appears because of who you are becoming. And if you've lived through moments where the backlash made no sense, where you were targeted without explanation, where criticism, betrayal, or loss hit you out of nowhere, this is for you. Let me say this clearly. What came against you was not provoked. It wasn't triggered by a flaw. It wasn't a punishment for being wrong. It was a reaction. A reaction to something within you that shifted before you consciously noticed it. Think back. There were moments when everything seemed fine. And then suddenly, it wasn't. People turned cold. Support disappeared. Accusations appeared without cause. You were left asking, "What did I do?" But here's the uncomfortable revelation. You didn't do anything. That's the point. The disturbance wasn't rooted in logic or circumstance. It was energetic. There is a signature carried by certain individuals, a presence that doesn't announce itself loudly, but reshapes the field around it. When that signature activates, it disrupts what thrives in stagnation. And disruption always invites resistance. Here's what makes this difficult to understand. The opposition often comes from unexpected directions, not just from obvious enemies, but from people who once felt neutral, even close. Why? Because when your frequency shifts, it exposes misalignment. And exposure makes people uncomfortable. They feel it before they understand it. They react before they can explain it. That's why the attack felt irrational. That's why it felt isolating. That's why explanations never fully satisfied. You were looking for a reason in the visible world, but the cause existed beneath it. And here's what's happening now. The same field that reacted to you is beginning to correct itself. Those who stayed silent. Those who watched you struggle and did nothing. Those who doubted you without evidence. They're starting to feel something unsettling. Not guilt exactly. Not regret yet. But unrest. A subtle internal pressure they can't name. Because when someone withstands an unprovoked attack and doesn't collapse, something activates. Resilience becomes authority. Survival becomes signal. And the universe responds to signals. What you lived through didn't weaken you. It marked you. Marked you as someone capable of carrying more. This is where most people misunderstand the chosen concept. It's not about favoritism. It's about capacity. Chosen ones aren't spared from hardship. They're entrusted with pressure. And pressure reveals structure. You didn't break. And because you didn't break, something irreversible was set in motion. But here's the part you haven't seen yet. The season of resistance is ending. Not because your adversaries changed, but because the assignment has shifted. What rises next isn't confrontation. It's alignment. And alignment brings a very different kind of consequence. Stay with me. Because in the next part, I'm going to show you why the attacks had to stop when they did. What's already moving in your favor behind the scenes. And how divine favor doesn't arrive loudly, but unmistakably. Here's what no one explained to you when the attacks were happening. They weren't meant to destroy you. They were meant to measure you. Every unprovoked strike, every moment of isolation, every unanswered prayer wasn't random chaos. It was a test of containment. Can you carry light without becoming bitter? Can you endure injustice without losing your center? Can you remain intact when validation disappears? Most people fail here. Not because they're weak, but because they were never built for that level of pressure. You were. That's why the attacks felt excessive, out of proportion, almost absurd in their intensity. Darkness doesn't overreact to ordinary people. It economizes. It only overextends when it senses a threat. And you were a threat long before you saw yourself that way. Think about how the pressure stopped making sense near the end. It didn't escalate forever. At a certain point, it stalled, shifted. faded into confusion rather than victory. That's not coincidence. There's a threshold in the unseen where opposition loses permission to continue. Once your internal authority surpassed a certain point, the attacks could no longer escalate without consequences they weren't willing to face. So the strategy changed. Silence. Withdrawal. Waiting. That's the phase you're in now. And here's what's quietly happening during this pause. The people who participated, actively or passively, are beginning to feel a reversal. Not punishment, exposure. They're replaying moments they once dismissed, revisiting conversations they avoided, feeling a pressure that doesn't come from you, but from within themselves. Because when divine alignment shifts, conscience activates, and conscience is uncomfortable when it wakes up late. You may not see this yet. You may not hear apologies. You may not get explanations. But the field knows. And the field balances itself. Here's the part that matters most for you. Divine favor doesn't arrive as revenge. It arrives as relocation. You're not being elevated above people. You're being moved away from interference. Doors that were blocked suddenly open without struggle. Opportunities align without chasing. Protection appears quietly, naturally. And here's the unmistakable sign: favor is near. You stop needing to explain yourself. When authority stabilizes internally, validation becomes unnecessary externally. That's when life starts responding differently. People listen without knowing why. Decisions land with clarity. Resistance dissolves without confrontation. And the ones who once opposed you? They feel it. Not as anger, as distance. You no longer occupy the same energetic room. That's divine favor. Not applause. Not vindication. Alignment. But there's a warning here, and it's critical. Favor doesn't stay where resentment lives. If you carry the old pain forward, it anchors you to the old battlefield. And you're not meant to fight there anymore. You're meant to move. Which is why the next phase requires something from you, not effort but awareness. Because the same sensitivity that made you a target also makes you receptive. And if you don't recognize what's changing, you could misinterpret the silence as emptiness. It's not empty. It's cleared. In the next part, I'll show you what divine favor actually looks like when it begins, why it often arrives disguised as endings, and how to avoid mistaking relief for stagnation. This is where the story turns. Here's the moment most people misunderstand. When divine favor begins to move, it doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like detachment. Things you once fought for stop pulling at you. People who once mattered lose emotional gravity. Battles that consumed your thoughts no longer invite participation. At first, this feels unsettling. You wonder if you're becoming cold, disconnected, unmotivated. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is repositioning. Favor doesn't drag you forward. It removes friction so you can move naturally. And friction is often disguised as familiarity. Think about this carefully. During the attacks, you were forced to stay alert, to defend, to explain, to endure. Your nervous system adapted to pressure. Now that the pressure is lifting, the absence feels strange. You confuse peace with emptiness because your body learned intensity as normal. That's why this phase is dangerous if misunderstood. Some people, when the attacks stop, go looking for them again. They return to old environments, old conversations, old dynamics, not because they want pain, but because pain feels recognizable. That's the trap. Divine favor doesn't shout, "You've arrived." It whispers, "You're no longer needed there." And the moment you accept that whisper, everything reorganizes. Here's what you may already be noticing. A fewer confrontations, a less need to justify yourself, a people backing away without explanation, a sudden clarity about what drains you, or an urge to simplify rather than prove. These are not losses. They are withdrawals of access. The field around you is becoming more selective. And selection always feels like reduction before it feels like expansion. But here's the deeper layer. Those who attacked you without cause didn't just misjudge you, they misjudged timing. They reacted early. They responded to a version of you that was still forming. And now that formation has stabilized, which means the same tactics no longer work. Confusion replaces aggression. Distance replaces control. Silence replaces interference. And silence is not neutrality. It's concession. But here's where your role becomes crucial. Divine favor amplifies whatever you align with next. If you align with bitterness, it magnifies isolation. If you align with resentment, it prolongs separation. If you align with clarity, it accelerates movement. This is why awareness matters more than action right now. You don't need to confront the past. You don't need to expose anyone. You don't need to reclaim your name. Your alignment does that automatically. When authority is internal, reputation adjusts externally without effort. And here's the paradox most never grasp. The people who once attacked you may never apologize, not because they don't realize what they did, but because awareness arrives too late for access. And that's not injustice. That's order. Because favor doesn't circle back to fix the past. It redirects the future. So if you've been feeling like something is ending without drama, if you've sensed a quiet closing rather than a loud victory, if you've noticed space opening where noise once lived, that's not stagnation. That's preparation. Because what comes next requires clarity, not armor. And in the next part, I'm going to reveal why the favor arriving now is conditional, what determines whether it fully activates, and the one internal shift that ensures you don't repeat the same cycle at a higher level. This is where discernment becomes protection. Here's the truth most people never hear. Divine favor doesn't activate automatically. It responds, not to effort, not to suffering, but to integration. What you went through was not meant to be escaped, it was meant to be understood. If you carry the lesson forward, favor accelerates. If you carry the wound forward, favor slows. That's the condition. And this is where many chosen ones stall without realizing why. They survived the attack, but they never released the identity it created. They stop seeing themselves as becoming and start seeing themselves as the one who endured. That identity feels justified. It even feels powerful. But it keeps you anchored to the frequency of opposition. Favor doesn't live there. Favor lives where authority is quiet. Let me show you what integration actually looks like. It's when you can recall what happened without emotional charge. When the memory no longer tightens your chest. When you don't rehearse conversations that will never happen. When you stop wondering why and start recognizing what. Because why keeps you looping. What moves you forward? What did you learn about boundaries? What did you learn about discernment? What did you learn about your capacity? Those answers are keys. And keys only work when you stop staring at the locked door. Here's something subtle you may already be experiencing. Your reactions are changing. Things that once triggered you now register as information. Disrespect feels obvious, not personal. Manipulation feels transparent, not confusing. That's integration. And when integration stabilizes, something powerful happens. The universe stops testing you in the same way. Not because you're favored, but because you're graduated. Tests repeat only when lessons are incomplete. And now, a new type of opportunity is approaching. It doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as a choice. A chance to respond differently. To walk away sooner. To stay silent instead of defending. To choose alignment over explanation. That choice determines whether favor fully engages. Because favor amplifies momentum, not resistance. If you lean into clarity, doors open effortlessly. If you lean into old patterns, the door stays closed, not as punishment but as protection. And here's the moment of honesty. Some people who attacked you will try to re-enter your life. Not aggressively, not openly, subtly. Curiosity, politeness, checking in. This isn't reconciliation, it's recalibration. They're trying to locate you energetically. And how you respond tells the field everything it needs to know. You don't need to reject them. You don't need to confront them. You only need to remain unchanged. Clarity doesn't negotiate. If access returns, the cycle restarts. If access stays withdrawn, elevation continues. That's the rule. And it's not cruel. It's precise. Because what's arriving next cannot coexist with unresolved entanglement. In the next part, I'll explain why your isolation was necessary, how solitude forged authority rather than loneliness, and how to recognize the moment when it's time to re-emerge without repeating the past. This is where strength becomes visible without effort. Here's something almost no one tells the chosen ones. Your isolation was not abandonment. It was containment. Power cannot stabilize in noise. When what's inside you begins to intensify, the universe reduces external input, not to punish you but to prevent distortion. That's why people disappeared without explanation. That's why conversations felt hollow. That's why even familiar environments suddenly felt wrong. You weren't losing connection. You were being withdrawn for calibration. Most people panic during this phase. They think something is wrong. They try to fill the silence with distractions, new people, new chaos. But you didn't. You sat with it, even when it was uncomfortable, even when the quiet amplified your thoughts. That choice mattered more than you realize, because solitude does something social environments never can. It strips performance. No audience, no validation, no reflection from others to borrow identity from. Only you. And when there's nothing left to perform for, what remains is truth. That's when authority begins to form. Not loud authority. Not dominating authority. Internal authority. The kind that doesn't need to convince. The kind that doesn't explain itself. The kind that people feel without knowing why. This is why your presence feels different now. You may not see it clearly yet, but others do. They hesitate before speaking to you. They choose words more carefully. They either open up deeply or keep their distance entirely. Both reactions are indicators. Because when authority stabilizes, it polarizes. Those aligned feel safe. Those misaligned feel exposed. And this brings us to a critical moment approaching in your life. Reemergence. Not rushing back. Not announcing yourself. But re-entering with a different posture. You're not going back to who you were. That version no longer exists. And this is where many chosen ones make a mistake. They re-emerge seeking connection, instead of allowing connection to respond to them. That reverses the polarity. You don't pursue alignment. Alignment recognizes you. So here's the rule for the next phase. Move slowly. Speak less. Observe more. Let people reveal who they are without interruption. Because the version of you that's emerging doesn't need to guess. You'll feel it immediately. Ease versus tension. Clarity versus confusion. Expansion versus contraction. Your nervous system is now an instrument. Trust it. Another sign reemergence is near? Opportunities are appearing that feel quietly right. No adrenaline rush. No desperation. Just a calm sense of this fits. That's favor working without theatrics. And this is important. What's arriving now won't look like a reward for suffering. It will look like alignment after maturity. Better access. Cleaner connections. More influence with less effort. And yes, some people from your past will watch this shift from a distance. They won't confront you. They'll observe. Because when someone realizes they misjudged you, they rarely admit it. They simply adjust their behavior. That's closure. You don't need apologies to move forward. Silence is often the acknowledgement. Now listen closely. The next test is subtle. It won't come as an attack. It will come as an invitation to over-explain, to prove, to re-engage old dynamics, just this once. That's the fork in the road. If you step back into explanation, you dilute authority. If you remain grounded, favor locks in. Chosen ones don't convince. They embody. And embodiment is what makes what's coming irreversible. In the next part, I'll reveal the final shift that separates those who briefly awaken from those who remain elevated, how to recognize when divine favor has fully activated, and what changes permanently once it does. This is where everything becomes effortless or repeat. There is a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when divine favor fully activates. Not when things explode, not when everyone applauds, but when resistance stops chasing you. Up until now, pressure followed you everywhere. Even in rest, there was friction. Even in progress, there was pushback. That phase is ending. And here's how you'll know. Situations that once required effort begin resolving without force. Conversations shorten. Decisions simplify. Paths that were blocked no longer fight you. They step aside. This isn't luck. This is hierarchy realigning. In the unseen order of things, authority determines flow. And once your internal authority stabilized, external systems had no choice but to respond. That's why delays suddenly collapse. That's why timing improves. That's why things start happening before you ask. Favor is not something added to your life. It's something that activates when interference is removed. And interference was never people. It was self-doubt, overextension, and emotional leakage. Those are gone now. You may still feel cautious, but that's wisdom, not fear. You may still feel quiet, but that's composure, not hesitation. Your energy is no longer scattered. It's directed. This is why manifestation language never fully worked for you before. You weren't meant to visualize outcomes. You were meant to become congruent. Congruence is alignment between who you are, what you tolerate, and what you move toward. And now? Those three are sinking. Here's something critical. Once favor activates, life tests you one final time, not to stop you, but to confirm permanence. The test looks harmless. An old pattern reappears lightly. A familiar dynamic tries to re-enter casually. A version of your past knocks softly, pretending nothing changed. This is not temptation. It's verification. If you re-engage emotionally, authority leaks. If you observe without attachment, authority seals. That's the line. And this is where many people lose what they almost secured. They mistake familiarity for alignment. But you won't. Because you've learned something most never do. Peace is not emptiness. It's correct positioning. You no longer chase stimulation. You value clarity. And clarity attracts opportunities that don't demand your nervous system as payment. Now notice this. People with influence begin noticing you quietly. Not praising. Not promoting. Watching. Because authority recognizes authority. And once that happens, doors open sideways instead of forward. Introductions. Invitations. Access without explanation. You won't need to tell your story anymore. Your presence will carry it. This is when speech changes. You speak less, but when you do, people listen. You act slower, but outcomes accelerate. That's divine efficiency. And here's the most important part. Once favor activates, nothing needs to be forced ever again. Force becomes the warning signal. Ease becomes the compass. If it drains you, it's not aligned. If it stabilizes you, it's correct. Simple. Clean. Final. In the last part, I'll explain what permanently changes once this level is reached, why some people will never cross it, and how to protect what you've activated without fear, isolation, or arrogance. This final piece determines whether favor remains temporary or becomes your default state. Once divine favor becomes your default, life stops feeling like a battle you must constantly prepare for. Not because challenges disappear, but because nothing has permission to destabilize you anymore. This is the permanent shift. Before, your nervous system reacted to life. Now, life reacts to your nervous system. That reversal is everything. You no longer scan rooms for approval. You no longer rehearse conversations in your head. You no longer anticipate resistance before it arrives. Your body understands something your mind used to argue with. You are safe to be fully present. And presence is the highest form of authority. This is why chosen ones often appear calm even in intensity, why they speak without urgency, why they don't rush to correct misunderstandings. They trust the field to organize around them. Here's what changes permanently. Your tolerance collapses. Not in anger. In clarity. You simply cannot remain where your energy contracts. Crowds feel different. Content feels heavier. Certain ambitions lose their appeal. You're not becoming disconnected. You're becoming precise. And precision protects favor. Because favor flows best through clean channels. Now, some people will misinterpret this phase. They'll say you changed. They'll say you became distant. They'll say you're not the same anymore. They're right. But not in the way they think. You didn't become colder. You became unavailable to chaos. That's not ego. That's maturity. And here's why many never reach this state. They confuse power with intensity. They think transformation must feel dramatic to be real. They seek constant confirmation. But real authority doesn't announce itself. It stabilizes. It makes fewer moves with greater impact. It doesn't defend its position. It holds it. This is also why you must protect this state gently, not aggressively. No walls. No isolation. No superiority. Just boundaries without explanation. Boundaries without emotion. Boundaries without apology. You don't owe access to anyone who hasn't earned resonance. And the right people won't challenge that. They'll recognize it. One final truth before we close. Divine favor doesn't make you special above others. It makes you responsible for yourself. You're not here to save everyone. You're not here to prove anything. You're here to move correctly. And when you do, life supports you effortlessly. That's the quiet miracle most people miss. So tonight, before you sleep, remember this. You were not attacked because you were weak. You were isolated because you were forming. You were delayed because alignment was still calibrating. And now? You're positioned, not to chase what's coming, but to receive it without strain. This is not the end of the journey. It's the end of resistance. And that changes everything.